In this video, I'm going to be talking about Mantelillo linen. What is Mantelillo linen? It's a type of material used by Spanish painters from the 16th, 17th century. Artists such as Goya, Velázquez, and El Greco used this material for their large-scale works. This material is amazing because it has beautiful patterns that are woven into the fabric, and you could use this to your advantage to create some beautiful textures when you paint. For the last 4 years, I've been collaborating with textile artist Hazte, and he has been gracious to provide me with samples to figure out the priming methods used by these old masters. Mantelillo is an amazing material. It does not behave like regular commercial linen. It has beautiful, distinct qualities. When you use paint without medium, the paint drags beautifully over this surface. The material is fundamentally different from anything that's available commercially today. What I've done is I've created a series of videos to highlight some of the differences. In this video that I'm going to be sharing with you guys, you could clearly see the difference when you use a dark pigment and a light pigment. This Mantelillo was prepared with a lead ground. In this sample, you could see a commercially prepared linen versus Mantelillo linen handwoven by Hazte. You could see when you use, for example, stack process lead white or any lead white, how the paint just handles in a very different way. The paint drags and it leaves a broken brushstroke. This type of brushstroke was common with painters such as Veronese, Titian, El Greco, even Velázquez himself in his early period used Mantelillo. And for a long time, I've been looking for this material, and Javier contacted me years ago, about 4 years ago, so we could start this project together. And I'm very grateful to him for allowing me to collaborate with him in this project. The project involves preparing the material using, in this case, gesso, calcium sulfate, and learning how to prime this surface, and concluding with a copy, preferably of a Spanish master, over this Mantelillo. And that's exactly what we did. We set out to recreate the fabric, recreating the materials, in this case, rabbit skin glue with a calcium sulfate base, followed by a copy using the same ground, the same materials that El Greco might have been using. This was a very challenging project because when you're using these materials, they're erratic. They don't behave like commercial materials. It's very important to mention that artists such as El Greco and these masters from the past had an intimate knowledge of these materials. And that is apparent when you see the works at El Prado Museum, which I had the opportunity to see up close, and also in Toledo. When I visited these collections, I was able to see a good state of conservation in a lot of these paintings. Francisco Pacheco in his Arte de la Pintura mentions El Greco and is dismissive of his technique. He mentions that gesso grounds flake off and that is not a good technique to follow. But when I visited these collections, I noticed the opposite. El Greco's paintings are in great condition. They don't exhibit the cracking that a lot of other civilian painters that were allied to Francisco Pacheco exhibit. For example, when using a lot of these thick clay-based primings, which I have explored in the past, the priming cracks. So that does not happen with gesso grounds. In this case, the gesso ground is not applied thickly, and that's one of the most important aspects of this. The gesso ground is essentially a wash, a very thin wash that goes over the linen and allows the gesso to sort of settle into the weave. And this makes a fundamental difference, followed by a very thin, medium-rich oil ground. And you would think, well, this is a very rich, medium oil ground. How could I paint over this? Well, the chalk is absorbent and absorbs some of the oil, leaving a satin matte sort of finish to this priming. So that's something that I discover as I work with these materials. And one of the most important things that I discover is how flexible this material can be. The linen can indeed be rolled, and obviously not a very tight roll. You have to, sort of create a lot of buffer. So the material's not being strained. So this is again a very important detail when sort of highlighting how painters like El Greco created these superb techniques that have stood the test of time. So what I want to do is I want to share with you guys the demonstration that I did of El Greco. This is a demonstration, a small detail of the burial of Count Orgaz. This painting is housed at the Church of Santo Tomé in Toledo. I had the opportunity to go to this church and record some video, and also I had the opportunity to take photos of the corners of the painting to detect the ground. Using Al Prado Museum's technical analysis, I was able to recreate the ground pigments and the materials that he used. So that's exactly what I did. I recreated the ground, and I set out to create a small copy using Mantelillo. El Greco indeed paints this commission with Mantelillo, and it took him 2 years to achieve this. What I notice is a strong use of grisaille. This is also true in some of his later paintings. In El Greco House Museum, there's a collection of unfinished paintings where you could kind of deconstruct the whole process that El Greco used to achieve a lot of the effects in his paintings. So that's exactly what I did. And I set out to do a grisaille painting. Initially, this grisaille painting, I started with black and white. And immediately I noticed that the painting was getting too cold. So I introduced, in this case, cypress umber, and that made the whole difference. The painting became neutral and it warmed up the tones, ready for layers that are flesh colors directly on top of the grisaille. I noticed that a lot of the paintings from the El Greco Museum or El Greco's house had grisaille layers in very thin upper layers, in this case, sometimes glazed layers such as azurite or red lake directly over the grisaille. There doesn't seem to be an intermediate layer. So that was a very interesting detail that I observed in this museum. And the painting that Greco uses, Mantelillo, for example, El Espolio, which is a wonderful altarpiece housed at the Toledo Cathedral, was also painted in Mantelillo. And in the raking light, you could see the Mantelillo texture. And this really lends itself to this beautiful effect, shimmering light, especially with the lead white as it captures the weave of the canvas. So these are wonderful techniques that I was able to study up close in Toledo. And when you begin to reconstruct these techniques, you begin to see how important each material is. Another detail is the palette. The palette for the flesh tones, I referenced an article published by the Museum of Seville, of Fine Arts of Seville. They published an article detailing the pigments of a portrait that El Greco did of his son. And here they detail the flesh palette. El Greco uses a lot of Carmen Lake for his flesh tints. Like many other Spanish painters, Carmen Lake was a staple in Spanish painting. The Spaniards had a monopoly in the Americas with cochineal coming from Mexico, and they manufactured the cochineal lake directly from the source. In a lot of cases, the cochineals of great quality, and I was able to recreate this pigment using a recipe from Palomino and some other painters from the 17th century from Spain. This resulted in a very beautiful color for flesh, and the detailed analysis from this technical journal from Seville details that he also uses vermilion. So although in the painting, the portrait of his son has a palette that is composed of white, yellow ochre, red ochre, Carmen Lake, and black, he does use vermilion in combination with the red lake, and he's also using azurite mixed with umber. They identify an umber type pigment or ochre type pigment that has been burned. In this case, probably burned brown ochre or burnt umber. And this is mixed with the azurite for a lot of the shadow passages, which makes sense. It gives a greenish tint. And in the flesh, mixed with white, it would lend itself to a greenish, or mixed with perhaps a little bit of yellow ochre. It lends itself to this greenish tint that would complement beautifully with the red. So a beautiful use of color by El Greco. This is typical of his style. He uses a lot of color like a lot of the Venetian painters did. He's allied to the Venetian style, and it makes sense that he would have used a lot of these pigments. So let's just go ahead and take a look. I'm going to go ahead and narrate some of the processes that I used to create this painting. So here I started with an orange ground, and this ground is composed mainly of red earth. I've used a dryer, in this case minium, and lead white. El Greco used these lead pigments to promote drying. He was using these pigments to expedite his process in order to perhaps finish a commission sooner to meet his deadlines. It seems to me that he was a painter that worked very quickly. He seems to have started the drawing with just a black color. In this case, I'm using ivory black or bone black. You could also add a little bit of umber to this to promote the drawing. And immediately after that, he seems to have applied the color very thinly in veils initially, and then he gets more opaque as he's working. There's a theory that El Greco started with tempera. I did not see any evidence of that in the paintings that I saw in El Greco Museum. The paintings just seem like straightforward oil, and the images just exhibit just a straightforward linseed oil. I did not detect anything fancy in this paintings that I saw in the museum. So I just used washed linseed oil, refined linseed oil to bound and hand ground my paints. In this case, I started with stack processed lead white, ivory black, and cypress umber. I developed the modeling with bristle brushes, which is very typical of what painters from Venice were using. And I switched to a squirrel hair brush for the finer passages. But mostly I used a bristle hair brush, which allowed me to do everything that I needed to do for the painting. So the paintings, there's nothing fancy in its execution. You could just see that it's a grisaille layer, and then it's allowed to dry, and then the upper layers are applied very thinly at first, and then El Greco finishes with bolder strokes. For the brighter colors, it seems like El Greco, he used a grisaille layer to begin with and lays the glaze right on top. The colors apply very thinly, perhaps with medium. And for this, I used just a little bit of oil with heat-bodied oil or sun-thickened oil diluted with spike oil of lavender. A pretty straightforward process. Pacheco does mention that El Greco retouches his paintings many, many times in order to show bravery. So that's exactly the process that I followed, and that resulted in a pretty straight process, very similar to perhaps Titian or Veronese or Tintoretto. El Greco does travel to Venice, and it's rumored that he was a student of Titian, or perhaps he was in collaboration with somebody who was associated with Titian's studio. So he brings that style to Spain, and he creates a hybrid style, a style that is drawing from his Byzantine style and also from the Venetian style to create this beautiful Mannerist style of his own. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I want to invite you to check out my course available at Udemy that it will have the full course. If you're interested, make sure to check out the description below. If you haven't subscribed to my channel, make sure to subscribe to receive future notifications for my live presentations. Have a good one. Thank you for joining.